In 1896, more people turned out in person to see William Jennings Bryan than turned out a century later to see Clinton, Dole, and Perot combined. 750,000 people got on trains and went to Canton, Ohio, where William McKinley conducted a front porch campaign. Then there's the conventional view of Victorian women, particularly political women, as mere ornaments. It is true, Grover Cleveland's sister Rose, before President Cleveland married in the White House, he was a bachelor, and he had his sister Rose serve as his first lady. She was an accomplished scholar, and she almost died of boredom. She confided to a friend the only way she managed to survive brain-numbing reception lines was by conjugating Greek verbs while shaking hands. Yet, this was also the age of Frances Willard and Susan B. Anthony, the latter of whom scandalized her neighbors in Rochester, New York in 1872 by voting the straight Republican ticket. Today, of course, the scandal would be not that she voted, which was illegal at the time, but that she voted Republican. Actually, Ms. Anthony had good reason to embrace the GOP in 1872, given the tactless observation of that year's Democratic candidate for president, the great reforming newspaper editor Horace Greeley, who said, quote, "The best women I know do not want to vote." Ms. Anthony was hardly more satisfied with the candidate she did support. After Ulysses Grant appointed 5,000 members of her sex to serve as postmasters, he plaintively asked her, "Isn't that enough?" On the contrary, Ms. Anthony told the president she sought, quote, "justice, not favors." For historians, it is not enough to unearth fragments of the past. They must then imagine them assembled in something approaching life. So I ask you, take a few minutes and try to imagine, if you can, another America. The America of 1876, a simpler, slower land whose citizens do not automatically look to Washington to solve their problems or to the man in the White House to feel their pain. Indeed, much of their pain can be traced to greedy or short-sighted politicians in Washington who would plunder the public treasury even as they squander the moral high ground won at such terrible cost on 1,000 fields of battle north and south. Now, consider the fate of the last 3 American presidents. Lincoln assassinated, Andrew Johnson impeached, Ulysses Grant tainted by the corruption of his associates. America in 1876 is a land emotionally drained by a quarter century of moral agitation, fraternal warfare, and post-war disillusionment. As with Dwight Eisenhower in the 1950s, Americans in the Gilded Age desired nothing so much as a respite from turmoil. It was that hunger for reconciliation, even restoration, as Andrew Johnson called it, over genuine reconstruction, that Grant captured perfectly in his Delphic utterance, "Let us have peace." It's a great soundbite. It's a great slogan. No one knew what it meant, which is why it's such a great slogan. If you're in the North and you fought under the general, you have utter confidence that Ulysses Grant, when he says, "Let us have peace," means let us enjoy the fruits of our hard-won victory. If you're in the South and you hear Ulysses Grant say, "Let us have peace," all sorts of wishful thinking kick in, and you take it as a code word for, I'm willing to wink and nod and let you restore as much of the post-war or pre-war society as possible. Grant, then and now, is the great American puzzle. His horror of bloodshed was matched only by his hatred of profanity. The man who earned renown as the first exponent of modern warfare, denounced by critics for more than a century as a butcher, grew sick at the sight of an underdone steak or a Mexican bullfight. Hopeless in civilian life, on the battlefield, Grant forgot his insecurities. "Find out where your enemy is," he once explained. "Get at him as soon as you can, strike at him as hard as you can, and keep moving on." At Shiloh and Vicksburg, Grant had no difficulty finding his enemy or striking with maximum force. In the presidency, he seemed out of his depth, a sphinx-like figure whose silences masked not hidden reserves, but an almost total vacancy of ideas or vision. As Edmund Wilson wrote of the feverish post-war years, it was the age of the audacious confidence man, and Grant was the incurable sucker. Perhaps it is no accident that Grant's favorite book was Innocents Abroad. In time, his name would enter the language in ways hardly imaginable to the hero of Appomattox, as Grantism became a byword for official corruption. His Secretary of War escaped conviction for bribery by a timely resignation. His minister to Great Britain, after marketing worthless mining stock to gullible Britons, had resorted to diplomatic immunity to evade British justice. Under Grant, post office contracts went to carriers who offered the highest kickbacks. His vice president, not to mention the Speaker of the House, and a dozen other members of Congress were implicated in the Credit Mobilier scandal, in which railroad promoters enriched themselves through millions of dollars in government bonds. Remember, after the war, during the war, it was decided to build a transcontinental railroad. Wonderful. Great engine of national unity, if you will, but also opening the door to corruption on an unimagined scale, because basically the federal government decided to give away to the railroads an amount of land larger than the state of Texas. Well, the possibilities for bribery and corruption are Texas-sized, and Congress took advantage of them. For good measure, the president intervened to save his private secretary, accused of complicity in the so-called whiskey ring, which defrauded the U.S. Treasury of millions. Apparently on the theory that charity begins at home, Grant took care of his household, even before he rewarded the old soldiers with whom he had fought the war, and who now organized themselves into flag-waving lobbies, equally in love with patriotism and pensions. Abel Corwin was a 61-year-old lobbyist who married the president's spinster sister, Virginia, for reasons having less to do with romance than roguery. As it happened, Corbin was the agent of unscrupulous Wall Street speculators led by Jay Gould and Jim Fisk. It was said of Fisk that he was first in war, first in peace, and first in the pockets of his countrymen. Together, this unholy trinity set out to corner the gold market. Having secured appointment of a co-conspirator as head of the New York Treasury Office, in September 1869, with Grant away from Washington, they went on a gold-buying spree. Panic ensued, yet it was short-lived. Rejecting Corbin's appeal not to intervene, Grant acted swiftly to foil the scheme, directing the Secretary of the Treasury to sell $4 million in government gold reserves. It gives you an idea of the size of the government and the economy, that you could break the back of this catastrophic event by selling off $4 million of gold. For good measure, he had Julia, Mrs. Grant, write to Corbin, warning him of certain ruin should the president's brother-in-law be implicated in the scam. Interesting. He didn't write. He had Julia write. To this day, the question of Julia's own involvement, raised by the timely delivery of $25,000 in cash to the White House, remains a favorite historical parlor game. No less important, Grant insisted that the American economy itself be based on gold. The first president to call for a line item veto, he issued more vetoes than all his predecessors combined. None more courageous or politically foolhardy than an 1874 bill to inflate the currency and thereby relieve distressed farmers. Under Grant, the national debt was significantly reduced, and the United States went from being a debtor to a creditor nation. In other ways, Grant's presidency differs from the corrupt bacchanal depicted by most historians. For one thing, his Whiggish sentiments did not ensure harmonious relations with the strutting peacocks of Capitol Hill. Grant took a special dislike to the imperious Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, who single-handedly torpedoed the president's idea of annexing the Dominican Republic as a refuge for freed blacks. This was a variation on the old colonization scheme to which Lincoln and others had committed themselves years earlier. It was a way out, Grant thought, of an impossible situation that Reconstruction had really degenerated into.